Okay, thanks, Irina. Hopefully everyone can see my screen and hears me okay. I get a thumbs up. Thumbs up. Great. Okay, awesome. Uh, Before I jump into the presentation, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Irina and her crew at UTSC. So I was going to throw a picture in here. I didn't. So I've been working with Irina on wetlands and carbon since about 2013 now, is I think the first time that we toured around Attica space sites, got in some kayaks, collected some cores. And I don't think either of us at that time would have realized that that kind of initial pilot scale piece of work would evolve into this national scale effort. And, again, I think this project was successful because of the pairing between academia and a boots on the ground conservation organization. And, it's roughly 4 years ago now, I think, Irina, that we were on a first call to discuss potentially submitting an application. And again, I don't think either of us realized how large this would get. And so really appreciate your leadership, the crew at UTSC, Diego, David, for keeping us on track. Your assistance has been absolutely outstanding and greatly appreciated. And then also just want to thank all of the academics and PIs, who have graciously shared their material and their expertise. Again, I think we've built a really astonishing team right across the country in a relatively short period of time, and are generating tons of interesting and exciting data. I'm going to do my best to share some of that with you in this presentation. I apologize if I do not capture all the material that was sent to me. I've done my best to try and capture the most relevant pieces. We will have some time to discuss this towards the end, so I'll try to make sure that I stay on track here. So just to start off and to come back to one of the pieces that Irina mentioned off the hop, going back to this piece by Nature United, published by Ronnie Drever, and a few of us on the call were involved in this effort. So Gail was involved, I believe Sarah was involved, I was involved as well, looking at nature-based solutions in Canada, and this chart's focusing specifically on wetlands. And again, while what Irina said is true, that we identified that nature-based solutions could greatly assist Canada in meeting its targets, one of the issues here was the great uncertainty with these nature-based solutions. And at that time, I think what we realized is that one of the biggest issues, understanding the full impact of these systems, was the relative lack of greenhouse gas flux data, in particular methane, for these systems, especially given the huge variety of wetlands that we experience in Canada, even just in our agricultural landscapes, considering non-peatland wetlands. So with that, I'll jump right into just a general description of Objective 2. So again, this cluster is really focused on measuring greenhouse gas fluxes, combining CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide between the atmosphere and ecosystems in wetlands and agricultural landscapes right across the Canadian agricultural landscape. And the goal here was to combine conventional methods like chambers, dissolved gas techniques, evolution chambers, and any covariance to get a better handle and to be able to tease out the relative contributions from the landscape to these fluxes and carbon sinks. One of the other pieces that I'll talk about at the front end is that there was a lot of historical work leading into this project too, where there was extensive coring of wetlands done right across the Canadian prairies, as well as some of the southern Ontario sites, to look at organic carbon accumulation, and that's going to be supplemented with additional coring work through this project as well. And then I've only listed here the core PIs. contributing to Objective 2. So there's myself from Ducks Unlimited, Matt Bogard from University of Lethbridge, Lauren Bortolotti, also from Ducks Unlimited Canada, Gail Chmura from McGill, Irina, Larry Flanagan from University of Lethbridge, Sarah Knox from McGill, David Lobb from the University of Manitoba, and Christian von Sperber from McGill. This does not account for the huge host of graduate students, postdocs, biologists and research biologists associated with DU, who are also working on this objective and doing the bulk of the heavy lifting in the field, actually collecting these samples. I would have probably needed another 2 slides to capture all of that information, but just wanted to acknowledge their contributions here. So the subtasks for Objective 2 from the proposal, again, I don't need to spend too much time here, but the first subtask was really to compile some of the published information on process controls of wetland carbon stabilization, greenhouse gas fluxes, and carbon sequestration. The 2.2 subtask was to develop standards and protocols to measure wetland organic carbon accumulation and greenhouse gas flux rates. Again, we haven't really tackled that explicitly, but there has been exchange amongst the group in terms of standardizing, for example, the way that we do dissolved gas measurements, the way that we're doing bubble flux estimates, and working closely with Sarah and Larry in terms of trying to harmonize and come up with comparable ways of doing the eddy covariance methodologies across sites. Subtask 2.3 is really the meat of this, where we're applying these methods to actually collect those measurements with respect to greenhouse gas fluxes from these systems. This is where I'm going to focus the bulk of this presentation on the essentially programmatic overview from the various PIs that were shared with me. Section 2.4 is focused on lateral flows of carbon in and out of wetlands. And I think this is the one where we may need to look at a refresh or re-strategize how we want to deal with this. Still an important issue, but given the types of wetland systems that we work on, especially in the prairies where their lateral fluxes are quite difficult to look at, we may need to come up with a new strategy and plan. But I think there are some exciting opportunities here that we will hopefully discuss towards the end. And then the last piece under Objective 2 was really to look at developing models to predict the potential for wetlands in terms of organic carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas reductions and understanding emissions. So I don't need to spend too much time on this slide other than to reiterate that I think with respect to the full proposal, we are generally on track and meeting these objectives, with the exception of 2.4, where I think we will, again, need to have some discussions on how we want to address that, how we want to potentially refresh that objective. And again, think that there are some potentially exciting opportunities to look at some novel ideas around what that might look like in some of these agricultural landscapes. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and essentially provide overviews, updates from the various PIs that were shared with me related to each one of these subtasks. And so I'm going to start with 2.1, again, focused on understanding process controls with respect to wetland carbon stabilization, organic carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas emissions. And so again, the first piece of work I want to talk about is that there was a lot of historical work done through a previous NSERC SPG that Irina led and that we had significant involvement in. And so this collected a huge number of wetland cores, again, from sites in southern Ontario and right across the Prairie Pothole region. And so we're already able to integrate a lot of this work, including some of the historical legacy work that Ducks Unlimited Canada was also involved in with our carbon project, which, I think occurred between 2003 and 2005. And so this is just an example of some of the work being done by one of Irina's grad students, Prabhasha Mistry. Again, looking at summarizing a lot of the carbon stock information that we've collected in these cores to come up with annual organic carbon sequestration rates, particularly for these intact wetlands. I actually believe the photos on the top here are from that Atticus Bay site, which was one of the first wetlands that we had sampled in southern Ontario. And so this work, again, also being done in conjunction with David Lobb's lab. So not only are we collecting information on the organic carbon stocks, but we're also doing cesium-137 lead-210 analysis to date these sediment increments and then look at carbon accumulation over time. Now, in addition to that piece of work, one of Irina's PhD students, Shiju Ma, has been compiling a lot of this information from the cores that we've collected across these sites, as well as historical greenhouse gas flux estimates that have been collected, for example, from Sheila Bonsal's group in the USGS, and the historical chamber-based measurements that we've done through Ducks Unlimited Canada through a series of projects, as well as the current pieces of work. And so again, this is being combined across the prairie pothole region to look at carbon sequestration rates and methane emissions. And so this is really a compilation of the existing information that has been collected in the Canadian prairies. Now, one of the other pieces of information relating to some of the historical work that's been done in this area, again, through the earlier NSERC SPG, is some work that we, again, was focused on some of the sites in southern Ontario, as well as the Canadian prairies. Here, I'm really just going to focus on the information, I believe, from a series of sites from Alberta. And this is related to some of the work done by one of Tim Moore's PhD students, Dan Dong, really looking at the samples that we collected across these sites and quantifying sediment, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus concentration, and looking at the stoichiometry across a set of intact, restored, and drained wetlands. And so the objective here of this work was to examine the vertical and horizontal variability in carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus concentrations and the stoichiometries to compare across these various management types. The hypothesis here being that organic carbon concentration would be higher in intact wetlands, secondly in restored, and then lastly in drained basins. And interestingly enough, there was some pretty distinct pretty distinct findings. So on the left-hand side here, we're essentially just looking at the concentration profiles for organic carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus going down core. On the right-hand side, we're looking at those ratios. And so what you can see is that the intact wetlands in this landscape, so near Camrose, Alberta, quite distinct, where we do see higher organic carbon in intact wetlands, and those are related to also higher CP and N to P ratios. Interestingly, the second highest is in the drained wetlands, and so that runs counter to the hypothesis, although that's not super surprising because we don't have a lot of information on when these wetlands were drained, and so it's not surprising that a drained wetland might still hold some of that signal from when it was in fact intact. But what this also points to is that through restoration, we're not always meeting those same sediment characteristics that we see in these intact wetlands with respect to carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And of course, those are going to have important biogeochemical implications for how these systems behave and fluxes and carbon sequestration. Now, the last piece I wanted to talk about on this front end with understanding controls is, again, some work that was actually done in combination by two of the PhD students. So this was some manuscript pulled together by Prabhasha and Shiju in combination to look at system controls on carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas flux rates. And so they developed an expert-informed, process-oriented conceptual model to explain natural variation in carbon sequestration, and then further identified predictor variables that could easily estimate that could easily be estimated from existing databases. And so this work, I believe, was published just towards the end of last year, if not early this year. So if you haven't seen this manuscript, I'd encourage folks to have a look through it. I think they did a great job synthesizing a lot of the information in current literature to look at these process controls on wetland carbon cycling. Sorry, I'm just going to check my time here and make sure I'm not going off the rails. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears from 2.1 and talk about just briefly some of the development of standards, protocols to measure wetland organic carbon accumulation and greenhouse gas flux rates. I don't have a lot of information to share here. Again, most of this has already been discussed. So we're using lead 210, cesium 137, looking at long cores in terms of dating these systems, looking at carbon accumulation that has essentially been standardized and adopted widely for the cores that we've collected, at least through the NSERC SPG and this current line of research with Dave Lobb's lab. There has been, a combination of dissolved gas, chamber, evolution traps, and micrometeorologic techniques applied for greenhouse gas monitoring and real-time carbon sequestration. And so again, here we've seen some exchanges between labs with Gail and Matt, exchanging information and having opportunities for students to learn some of these techniques for the sites that DUC is monitoring. We're working closely with Matt to make sure that we are standardizing, again, our dissolved gas monitoring techniques as well as our evolution techniques, and then working with Sarah extensively in terms of the data pipeline processing for flux tower work. Some of the pieces that we're going to be looking at going forward is we want to investigate doing the dissolved gas sampling using drones. So currently, a lot of the dissolved gas monitoring is done just using pair of chest waders and wading into the wetland and collecting a sample. Sometimes it's done via boat. Both of those mechanisms introduce disturbance, and it's always challenging to me to be completely clear whether we're collecting a clean sample and not influencing the dissolved gases in those samples when we're in fact disturbing the environment, whether that's through wading in or using a boat. We always try to do our best not to disturb the environment and sample from a relatively undisturbed area. But I think one of the things we want to do is compare this with some drone-based sampling. So we have a splash drone that's going to be equipped with essentially a column monitoring device where we can in fact compare manual measurements with drone-based measurements. In addition to potentially reducing disturbance, this might allow us to be a little more efficient. Obviously, if you can collect a sample from a drone and you don't need to wade into the center of a wetland, you can save some time and build in some efficiency in terms of your sampling program. There's some exchange in terms of looking at above ground and below ground biomass, and so there has been some attempts across various sites to do this. I don't know if we've standardized this yet, so this is potentially one of the areas that we can look at some ideas in terms of collaborating and again building in seamless ways of doing this across sites. And then lastly, we may want to have a discussion towards the end, do we need to form some subgroups around harmonizing some of these protocols? And so with that, I'm going to jump into the crux of the presentation here, which is focused on subsection 2.3, using standards and the methodologies developed to actually measure greenhouse gas fluxes from these systems. And so I'm going to proceed from east to west over these sites, and will again do my best to capture the information shared with me, and apologies if I miss anything, and again we can come back to some of these towards the end if need be. And then just before I launch into the most eastern site, I just wanted to present this map to give you an overview, in fact, of the sites that we are monitoring across the country. And so this is pretty astonishing, I think, given the huge diversity of wetlands and the geographic range that we are covering. We're going from the interior of British Columbia to coastal freshwater impoundments in Atlantic Canada, covering wetlands in southern Ontario, and prairie potholes right across the three soil zones in Canada. So the first group up is Gail Chamorro's group out of McGill. And so this is the freshwater impoundment work focused in Atlantic Canada, where Gail and her PhD students, Wendy Hampuero and Rona Abade, as well as an MSc student, Rachel Plant, have been doing work. And this is really focused on, for example, doing monthly and winter greenhouse gas flux in open water, looking at biomass and vegetation. And then some of the work that's underway is doing greenhouse gas flux of emergent cattail, sediment carbon storage, and vegetation mapping from these sites. And so just a snapshot here of some of the biomass work that I previously discussed. So this is, I believe, some of the work that Wendy is involved in, looking at cattail biomass and impoundment age, and developing a modified technique essentially for estimating cattail biomass at some of these sites, where she's developed a predictor for doing this, I believe, in the absence of needing to actually collect a full range of samples and drying those and actually measuring out the weight. And so again, this is an interesting trend, looking at cattail biomass with impoundment age, and of course, likely going to have some implications for greenhouse gas emissions from this site. Also, as I mentioned, there's work being done on quantifying dissolved gas emissions and integrating bubble traps from these sites. And so again, here we're looking at monthly total methane flux, both diffusive and evolution from these impoundments. And so you can see some of the seasonal variation from these sites. Interestingly, and we'll see this at one of the other sites, you can see that the winter sampling shows this, increased concentration of methane under the ice. And I think this is going to become something that's going to be quite important to look at in the future going forward. Again, we'll see something similar for the Atticus site. And there are obviously numerous prairie wetlands too, although we tend not to sample those ones that can also be deeper and potentially will show these same types of trends. Now, moving a little further west to the Atticus Bay region, this is some of the work that Christian von Sperber and his grad student, Collar Jones, have been involved in. And so again, this is one of the large intact wetlands at the Atticus Bay site. The hypothesis here was to look at some of the seasonal variation with respect to methane emissions, and the hypothesis being that under high water table, low temperature, we would see low methane concentrations in the spring, going to summer, where low water table, high temperature would result in high methane concentrations, to the fall, where a high water table, low temperature were predicted to have lower methane concentrations, and they were really unsure of what they were going to see during the winter. And so this chart here, in fact, is looking at water temperature and methane concentrations over time. And although I cannot definitely resolve the time frame on the x-axis, if I recall correctly, what's happening here is that we're seeing again much higher methane concentrations under ice during the winter period, again indicating that there's an accumulation of methane under the ice when you have free water occurring under the ice. And so again, supporting some of the work that Gale students are finding in freshwater impoundments in Atlantic Canada, and again, potentially has implications depending on how climate change rolls out, and potentially leading to shallower systems that usually freeze right through, maybe having free water under ice and accumulating methane through the winter. I guess I could have clicked the next part to highlight the high concentrations of methane under ice. One of the other interesting pieces of work that Christian student has done was to look at the impacts of goose feces and manure on greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is quite interesting. Obviously, you can see here that at the higher application rates for both goose feces and manure, that we see significant increases in methane concentrations. And of course, this is potentially of interest to, for example, Ducks Unlimited Canada. We have large legacy sites right across the country that are meant as staging areas where, you know, we'll have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of waterfowl accumulating. So again, this points to me that there may be some work required to go in, look at some of these large legacy projects in terms of the concentration of waterfowl using them, but then also looking, for example, as the question from Sheer highlighted, depth. So again, these larger projects tend to be deeper. You'll see from some of the work I'm going to present from Okamic that we're seeing higher methane fluxes from that site. So again, some notion here to look at some of these other circumstances that we likely see across some of these managed wetland sites with respect to inputs from waterfowl and implications for depth. Now, the last piece, well, not necessarily the last piece, but one of the broader pieces of work that we've done is the work across the prairie pothole region. This is some of the earlier measurements that were collected, which really only focused on one soil zone in the Canadian prairies. This has been expanded to cover all three soil zones in the prairie region and has been expanded to cover restored wetland sites in southern Ontario, as well as rangeland sites, rangeland wetland sites in the interior of British Columbia. And so this information that I'm presenting was compiled by Matt Bogard, the lab, and in particular, one of his postdocs, Laura Lagazzo. And so this is work that's also been recently published. Again, I'm only showing some of the earlier analysis from some of the prairie pothole sites. This is going to be expanded to cover that wider geography. And so again, at these sites, we've seen significant differences in the water quality, and this is obviously important for drivers of methane emissions. And so if the way we've structured the sampling at these sites was to look at wetlands both embedded in cropland versus wetlands embedded in perennial landscapes. And so again, what we're seeing here is that wetlands embedded in perennial cover typically have lower total phosphorus concentrations and higher sulfate concentrations. And this has implications for the greenhouse gas emissions from those wetlands. And again, what we're seeing here on the figure on the left is that these cropped wetlands tend to have significantly higher greenhouse gas emissions, and that's almost entirely related to methane emissions. Whereas in the perennial sites, we have significantly lower greenhouse gas emissions. And again, that's driven mostly as a result of methane emissions. So again, we're going to be looking at this. This was really just focusing on wetlands in the black soil zone of the PPR initially. We're going to look at this across the full complement of PPR wetland sites, as well as the sites in southern Ontario and British Columbia. See if these trends actually hold up across broader geographies. Some of the additional work that Matt's been doing is looking at essentially a gradient of sites in Alberta, going from northern sites in and around Camrose to central sites just south of Calgary, and some more southern sites down by McIntyre Ranch. Here, they're looking at dissolved oxygen, water quality, dissolved organic carbon, greenhouse gas emissions. And he's seeing some interesting trends in terms of the GPP versus ecosystem respiration. And I think some trends that are a little counterintuitive, especially with respect to I think I have to, I deleted one slide and it was probably the most important piece. I may have to come back to Matt to this afterwards because there was some trends with respect to evapotranspiration and the isotopic signatures. I don't think I'm capturing it here, but where we're actually seeing less evaporative effects at the southern sites, which is counterintuitive, and so some work to do in understanding that. The other piece of information that Matt's group is collecting at these sites is further quantifying ebullitive fluxes, and again some trends here that are relatively interesting, looking at evolution versus diffusive emissions. And again, historically, lots of folks would tell you that evolution is the most important methane emission to capture from wetlands. What we're starting to see at some of these prairie wetland sites is that, in fact, the diffusive emissions are significantly higher than evolution. And so we will further be able to examine this at some of the flux tower sites. And so that's really the next phase that I'm going to jump in here with. Sorry, just checking my time. It looks like I'm getting short. Sorry.
So Pascal, if you could do it in 5 minutes, we do want to protect some time for discussion.
Yeah. Okay. I will rip through these quickly. So through this project, we've been able to deploy essentially a network of flex towers now at a number of sites, including 3 in Manitoba, and then some of Larry's sites in Alberta, and a site that Sarah is going to be deploying in Quebec in the next few weeks. This slide is really just showing you the Manitoba flux tower site. So we have a wetland embedded in cropland, a wetland embedded in perennial cover in southwestern Manitoba, as well as a flux tower at Okamic Marsh. All I want you to take away from this slide is that we've captured a massive range in variation, both in terms of, mostly in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions and especially the methane emissions from these sites, but there's also differences, significant differences in terms of net ecosystem exchange. This is really just summarizing that annual difference. And so again here, and this lines up quite nicely with some of the work that Larry has done. Again, our Scenoplectus or bulrush site is coming out as a net sink for carbon and has very low methane emissions. We see the cattail agriculture site has higher methane emissions, and then our site at Okamic has substantially higher methane emissions. And so all of this is going to help us understand some of the drivers behind the differences here, and already some interesting perspectives to consider in terms of how we actually restore and manage some of these large legacy wetland sites. This is the location of the new flux tower site that's going to be deployed just outside of Montreal at a restored wetland site that Ducks Unlimited Canada owns and operates. It's also on national defense land, so it took a significant heavy lift from Sarah's group to get the permits in place to do this. I'll switch gears here and talk a little bit about Larry's sites. So as part of this project, Larry is going to be deploying a flux tower site, or has deployed a flux tower site at Sterling Lake. Really interesting opportunity here because that site was bone dry in 2024, and we're expecting it to receive water in 2025. So very interesting opportunity here to get the transition between a dry site to a flooded site. I'll just share this quickly, some of the information that Larry has been collecting across the site. Again, interesting here to see, essentially the diurnal change in both heat flux, net ecosystem exchange, and methane emissions. Again, here, I'm surprised, we can maybe discuss this later, but again, it seems here that the changes in methane are quite low, likely due to the fact that the system is dry at the time. And so Larry has quantified this in terms of looking at ecosystem photosynthesis, total ecosystem respiration, and quantifying the net productivity and accounting for methane, which again at this site is quite low. It'll be interesting to see how that transition as the site goes from dry to wet. Now, the last piece to talk about here is 2.5, which is the development of models to predict the potential for wetlands for organic carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions. And so again, I'll just hit on these very quickly. So this is again some of the work that has been done by Prabhasha to develop machine learning models to predict carbon sequestration across these wetland sites. Shiju has also done some expanded work to look at new metrics for integrating, for example, GWP star, where now we can look at various time frames in terms of how wetlands are performing with respect to net radiative cooling. So we've identified that there's issues with using GWP 100 in terms of it limits you to that 100-year time frame. The argument that I would make is that we need to consider the longer term perspective and the fact that a lot of these intact wetlands have existed on the landscape for thousands of years. And so one of the ways for us to go in and quantify that is to integrate some of the fluxes that we've been collecting through these new measurements and apply them in the GWP star model that Shiju has looked at to, in fact, look at where these systems are in terms of net cooling versus net warming. Again, this is just an example of some of the work that Shiju has been doing that I spoke about a little earlier, but integrating, again, all of these measurements, both in terms of carbon sequestration, methane emissions, and then projecting forward under various climates, how these systems are going to behave. And then the last two pieces I wanted to focus on here was some of the modeling work that Sarah's group has been involved in. And so I'm not doing this justice, but Sarah's grad student, Darian Ng, had done some work to look at remotely sensed products in terms of NDVI, moisture indices, to identify how these correlated to methane fluxes, and then was essentially able to use this to extrapolate and predict and upscale methane estimates beyond flux towers using remotely sensed products. And then the last piece, again, here is some of the work that Larry has done using the scaling technique with NDVI to look at, again, whole ecosystem productivity. And so this is, again, integrating the flux tower measurements, looking at photon flux density and NDVI, and then scaling this. And so again, I think there's mechanisms here to combine a lot of the work that's being done, both in terms of scaling methane emissions, but also in terms of scaling the vegetative productivity at these sites to look at how these are performing in terms of carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas fluxes across broader landscapes. Okay, and so to kick off the discussion here, some of the final pieces we're talking about collaboration between and within objectives. Obviously, we are coordinating and sharing techniques. DU has been assisting with site selection, and we're happy to continue to do this. And then, as I've mentioned, there's, I think, some potential within these objectives for using results, for example, from the flux towers, from the wider extensive network of monitoring sites to further test GWP star on current carbon fluxes and radiative impacts. Collaboration between objectives. We just had a meeting last week with George Arendidis and Irina at UTSC, with Sarah and Matt. And I think there's going to be expanded opportunity for coordinating and sharing data collected within Objective 2 to assist with some of the modeling efforts under Objective 3. And then additionally working with the postdoc who's been hired under Objective 5 to essentially simplify and incorporate some of this information into the whole. Some of the forward-looking pieces that I think we can talk about, again, what we would do with more resources. Again, we may want to come back and talk about lateral fluxes. I'm particularly interested in the notion of biological carbon fluxes. So I've brought this up a few times now. We usually do a pretty good job of capturing what's coming into these wetlands, but there's a lot of biological material migrating out, whether that's through invertebrates, amphibians, waterfowl who are feeding and building eggs on site. There's a lot of energy and carbon that is in fact exported out of these systems. And I think it would be a very novel idea to try and quantify that and see what proportion of the carbon budget that actually accounts for. We've been thinking of things like testing soil amendments in terms of using products like calcium sulfate to reduce methane emissions in newly restored wetlands. One of the other areas that we've talked about is quantifying impacts of, for example, wetland drainage on carbon stocks and greenhouse gas emissions through an experimental wetland drainage project. And then lastly, I think this is the last slide here, anticipated impacts. So, you know, the information that we're collecting at the Flux Tower sites that have been operated by DC are publicly available via the AmeriFlux network. There has been thousands of downloads of this data already. I'm amazed at the number of emails I get every day telling me that this data has been downloaded. And so it's great to see people from around the world actually accessing the data and integrating it into their models. One of the things that I think we can focus on is a generation of new regionally specific default emission factors for Canadian agricultural landscapes with respect to wetland emissions. Right now, there's just one default emission factor for cold temperate wetlands, and I think it dramatically overestimates wetland emissions from the systems that we work on. And so the information we're collecting, I think, will allow us to look at this regionally across agricultural landscapes in Canada. All of this, of course, I think leads to a better understanding of wetlands as nature-based climate solutions over longer timescales, potentially allows us to work with some of the mapping components and looking at this in a go-forward ability, and then also hopefully enables us to target wetland conservation and restoration of wetlands, you know, through the identification of drivers and some of these scaling techniques, hopefully to focus on areas where we know wetlands have an opportunity to be more climate positive as to potentially being more climate negative. So I'm going to stop there. I apologize. I realize I've gone over time. Happy to field any questions, although I may need to rely on some of the PIs if there are specific program questions.
So first of all, Pascal, you probably had the hardest job of any of us in trying to synthesize so many of the team members. I think you did a fabulous job, and congratulations to every person who contributed some of those slides. Well done. I think in future we might have to give Obj2 more time just because of the sheer number of investigators there. I want to ask, if we have 3 minutes before the lunch, if those who want to take the break, please feel free to take that. But if you could give us an extra 5 minutes and be able to address questions, I'd really appreciate it. One is a scientific question that comes from Sheil, and basically really fascinating results from Matt Bogart and his team on the correlation between cropland, salinity, and methane. So lower salinity, higher methane, higher salinity, lower methane. And Sheil's question comes, are the reason for the cropland because that's what, do they plant crops where there's lower salt in the soils? And is that it's not a spurious correlation, but is that why the salinity is low there? Or is it something to do with the human activities that might be changing the salt concentration?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we had identified right off the hop. And we did kind of a crude analysis to look at the proximity of some of these sites. So in fact, some of the wetlands that we're monitoring will have one that's embedded in perennial cover, and the other one embedded in cropland is literally across the road. And so we tried to use this approximation as a method to understand, you know, is it the salinity that's driving whether people are planting crops or not? Or is it just that they had an opportunity? I don't think we've teased it apart perfectly yet. And so it's still a little bit of a struggle there. But again, based on the proximity of these some of these sites, it doesn't look like the salinity is necessarily always what's driving whether those sites are cropland or not.
I wanted to just bring up the point, you know, that these treatment differences aren't randomly distributed on the landscape. Goes back into Roland's earlier comment that farmer decisions, you know, are potentially, you know, what's driving the differences between crops and grasslands. maybe statistically it can be teased out a little bit as well.
Yeah.
So I want to maybe be inclusive of some of the other contributors and get their ideas on some of the things that we've observed. Pascal talked about the fact, and I think Matt's not here, and that's why I'm not speaking to Matt directly because he had a conflict. But if you are, Matt, jump in. Really interesting data to show the importance of diffusive fluxes on the Alberta-Saskatchewan. And I can't help but be reminded of the incredible video that Christian shared with us about the massive bubbling that's happening in the east. And yet, I don't think the depth of the wetlands were that different. And so do you have an understanding or insight into why some wetlands are predominantly diffusive fluxes and others are from ebullition?
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure if we've, I do think that there is potentially a depth signal there, especially with respect to winter emissions and methane accumulation under the ice. Again, in the prairies, the wetlands we're working on generally freeze right into the bottom. The top foot of sediments will be frozen. So there's not a lot of biological activity. That's one of the things that the flux towers have helped us identify, is that there's very low emissions in the shoulder seasons. Historically, people thought that these prairie wetlands were pulsing massive amounts of methane in the spring. I heard that comment numerous times. We do not see that at all. It's not until temperatures hit about 15 degrees Celsius where we start to see a ramp up in methane emissions. With some of these deeper southern sites, for example, in Atlantic Canada and southern Ontario, there's always water under the ice. And so those sediments are always going to have some level of productivity and the capacity to produce methane to accumulate under ice. So I think it's going to be cool to factor in some of these depth signals. And again, the Okamic Marsh, where we have a flux tower site, had the highest methane emissions of all our flux tower sites. That also speaks to the fact that when we're building a marsh like that, in fact, the nesting island where that flux tower is deployed is built by excavating 2 borrow pits to build the nesting island. So there are these deep pools adjacent to the nesting island, which, if we believe some of the work that we're seeing from Atlantic Canada, southern Ontario, these deeper pools are potentially also a greater source of methane. And so that's something that I think we're going to hopefully tease apart with some of the evolution chamber-based work, and then looking at the actual footprint analysis from Okamic.
Thanks, Pascal. Christian, do you want to add to that? And by the way, if you could share that video with us, I think others would marvel at it as well. It was pretty impressive. But do you have further insights?
Sure, I can look for the video if I find it in my folder mess. Just give me 5 minutes. But what I wanted to mention is, I think it's exactly right what Pascal said. It has a lot to do with seasonality and differences in seasonality of the different types of wetlands that we find. So both Calder and Shear, they've been out basically in a bi-weekly mode in the wetland in Ontario, and they've collected tons of informal observations. One of this was this time in late spring, early onset of summer, when Calder took this video, when he found there was these patches of biofilms or something surfacing from the underneath, and together with that, huge bubbling. Right, and he was really struck by this observation. This is why he took this picture. And I don't know, Sheer, maybe you found something similar during your field work. I'm gonna look whether I quickly can find it. I'm here.
Yeah, that's likely Plocon, Christian. So often sediments will get essentially a mat of algae, usually like a blue-green algal mat, will form over the sediments, and then if you have a lot of productivity or potentially methane evolution, those mats then tend to detach and they'll float around as these little carpets in the water column.
Thanks. I'm gonna, in the interest of time, if you could find that over the lunch break and share it, I'm sure people would be curious. But maybe
I actually have it right now, so I can quickly share it if you want. Or better later.
we'll do it later. And I
Okay,
just want to
yep.
be able to acknowledge Gail's amazing work on the methane under the ice. And Gail, did I get it right that if you were to do a mass balance, that the methane under ice is larger than what you would get during the open water season?
Well, Rachel, hopefully, Plant, who took those samples, who I have to congratulate her and the other grad students. I didn't happen to have to go out there on the ice, but so congratulations to them. That stuff is collecting over, I forget, Rachel, something like 60 days. We had to guess the ice season. So if there were no ice there, the question will be, would just smaller amounts of methane be coming out every day, and then, or that's really the big question. But it's something that we would not capture, I think, if we waited till the ice were gone, because all that could come out as, yes, as a big pulse once the ice melts.
That's really fascinating. And I don't know if George is on or listening, but I believe that other people are looking at this on larger lake systems as well, and the ice and the methane forming under there. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of connection to upscaling that phenomenon, which I think is really important, and a lot of people are really excited to learning more about. Christian, if you could flip your camera on, I just thought maybe you could give a little bit of context for this video that we're about to see.
I have to unmute. Sure. So this video has been taken by my master's student, former master's student Calder Jones, who's been out in the field in Natokas basically every second week to collect water samples. And Calder was really very, very attentive to the environment, what was going on. He was always reporting new waterfall he was seeing, and reported about the behavior of the cows and so on. And one day he came back very excited. It was in late spring, where he found these bubblings and these Pascal, I forgot how you called them. These algae mud that have been loosened from the bottom sediments of the wetland. And yeah, maybe you can enlarge the video, Diego.
And so do you think these are CO2 or methane bubbles, Christian?
I don't know. I mean, we don't capture the bubbling, but we were thinking, since methane concentrations are so high in the wetland, that there's a likelihood that it's maybe both, or at least certain contribution of methane as well.
Well, it must have been a fascinating experience to be on the pond looking at that. So thank you for resurrecting it from your files. And again, the importance of being able to think about what drives wetlands that are more diffusive versus ebullition as the dominant transfer of greenhouse gases from the sediments to the surface. So again, really appreciate it, Christian. Right now, we're going to turn our attention to Objective 3 presenter, which is George. And did you have a quick comment, David?
Yeah, I was just going to comment. Sorry for catching that. Just a quick comment. When we were first doing a wetland work out in Manitoba, we were doing over like 12 months, and we were doing over winter sampling, chamber-based sampling. And it struck me that some of the wetlands had holes in the ice, obviously from bubbles, but they would go through like 3 feet of ice. The hole would go straight down. In other words, where the gases were being produced was static at the base. We tried to measure whether it was CO2 or methane, or addressing your question. We assumed it was mostly methane, but we could not capture enough gas with our chambers, even put over those things, to determine what it was. It was such a small quantity in our sampling. But what was so interesting was that these ice, like the ice develops over like 3-month period, and the bubbles were going straight up through that ice. So they're persistent or static in terms of the location. But we actually mapped out the density. We were getting these static bubble points about every 20 to 30 centimeters across the whole surface of the ice. and they were about 2 to 3 millimeters in diameter. They
That's
just
fascinating.
perforated the whole ice structure.
Thanks for sharing that, David. Anyone else have follow-up questions, please use the chat. But for now, we're going to pass it on to George